leader of a Christian nation, defines for the world who is Islamic and who is not. Now imagine President Erdogan of Turkey standing up and saying, let me tell you what a Christian is like. Wouldn't all of you believers listen carefully to him? It's poppycock, it's pretension, it's verbiage, it's not helpful to any vision of American foreign policy. Obama came up with an alternative to Bush, which said, let's collaborate and work together. And he failed to implement that because we're not collaborating in Iraq. We're not collaborating in Afghanistan. We're not collaborating in Syria. And he lost all elements of leadership. We got rid of the chemical weapons in Syria, not because of Barack Obama. Quite to the contrary. He, in an act of supreme hypocrisy, announced that, well, he wouldn't take any military action without congressional approval. Congressional, he didn't just limit to the Senate, where there was a Democratic majority. He included the House, led by Boehner. They wouldn't vote to give him food if he was starving. I mean, what crap, what hypocrisy. And the only reason it worked out, in spite of his lack of leadership, is Putin had the vision and the stature to stand up and say, we've got to stop this from happening. And Putin took over. Imagine the humiliation. It's good that the Russians play a major role in foreign policy. It's not good that they have to clean up the mess made by an inept American administration. And those are the realities, and they're tragically sad. Because you see, when Bush left, he did it. Does that mean stop or you'll hit me? He kept going through. So let me simply conclude. Bush did have a muscular view of foreign policy. Obama said we need to do it differently. And to a large extent, what Obama simply is doing is waffling, and it isn't working, and he's not doing it.
Let me begin by addressing the Bush comparison. Pick one of the most unpopular presidents in the last 60 years, aside from Richard Nixon, who's not so unpopular anymore, by the way, largely because, with the passage of time, his foreign policy vision has become more regarded by the American public and by leaders. This is a sleight of hand by Professor Schoenfeld, which he's well and widely known for doing. Let's pick the most unpopular person to compare Barack Obama to, and if you agree, as he suspects most of you will, based on your political leanings, not his, that you'll accept the premise that Bush was a disaster, then you sort of slide into having to accept the premise that Obama is a disaster as well. This country has not had a deep paradigm shift in how we conduct foreign policy since the Japanese invaded Pearl Harbor when Franklin Roosevelt was president of the United States. We had paradigm shifts prior to that. We had one coming out of World War I, and we had one preceding World War I. But we have been in this muscular, aggressive use of military force paradigm. Exactly the reason that people think Putin is so wonderful. I mean, I was surprised that when he was in China, he didn't pull his shirt off and put it on the back of the wife of the president of the Chinese People's Republic. That's the sort of person Americans would love to have. Bring back Ronald Reagan on a horse with a bit in its mouth. That's the kind of manly person that has defined American foreign policy interventionism for more than 70 years. But when Americans voted for Barack Obama in 2008, they weren't just kidding around when they said they want to change. Sometimes change is not too easy to accept. Sometimes change takes a while to adjust to. But this is a president which is not only trying to change how domestic policy gets done in this country, he is trying to change the role of the United States abroad. Criticize the change if you wish. First, to do that, you need to understand it. And second of all, you need to see whether or not the change has successful results. Although I can tell you, those successful results are not going to be measured in the conventional way that we measure success. Numbers of people killed by American troops. Pick a country. Number of American body bags coming back to the Dover military base in Dover, Delaware. Ain't too many of those coming home lately. There are some, but there aren't too many. We've just come out of a time period in which there were so many coming back that the Defense Department refused to allow the press to cover it because they saw what happened during Vietnam when the American public actually saw what a body bag filled with an 18 or 19-year-old looks like coming back from a war zone. We're not going to be able to measure success that way anymore. Although it would hardly surprise me if even a Hillary Clinton, should she be elected president in 2016, would return to that muscular kind of foreign policy. How do we judge that? A reasonable yardstick for measuring Obama's presidency, argues Benjamin Goldsmith of the University of Sydney, Australia, is to compare Obama with, other actual presidents, rather than to speculate about what would have been better or what amounts to fantasy politics about missed opportunities. Now, this approach allows for a comparative analysis using general counterfactual logic, but thinking across types of successes and failures, rather than trying to ask, for example, what would FDR have done in the aftermath of 9/11? Under Obama, there has been no equivalent to the Bay of Pigs fiasco, the Vietnam War, Iran-Contra, withdrawal from Somalia, or the Iraqi War. Oh, he's failed. He didn't do any of those miserable, horrible, disgusting, unethical, immoral things. There's been no major scandal to tie up the Obama presidency, seriously impairing its effectiveness abroad. There's been no Rwandan genocide that America could stand by and watch. As Goldsmith concludes, in spite of criticism regarding inexperience, Obama has avoided the self-inflicted fiascos the country endured under Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Reagan, Clinton, and George W. And he has spared us often the great cost in terms of lives, prestige, and money. If that's a failed president, I'll take failure any time over the so-called successes of all those other American presidents. All of them, by the way, like President Obama, have found the Middle East a difficult thing to handle. Thank you.
Well, we now have a chance for some questions for our debaters. Open it up. The second question will go to the other debater. So, who has a question? Yes, sir.
So, Professor John Bell, you mentioned that Obama had no right to address the ISIS militants as not representing Islam. That as a Christian, he had no right to say what is or is not Islamic. But just 2 weeks ago, excuse me if I mispronounce.
He has a right to do whatever he wants to. He's just very pretentious. I mean, so if I gave you the other impression, that wasn't the one.
Whether or not it was pretentious. Excuse me if I mispronounced his name. Just 2 weeks ago, Mujib Rahman, the senior advocate of the Pakistani Supreme Court, spoke here and agreed with Obama that the ISIS militants do not represent what Islam stands for. So what would your response to him be?
I'm sure there are a variety of views in the Muslim world. And just as there are a variety of views in the non-Muslim world. All that I'm saying is that for a president of the United States, a Christian nation, to take a definitional position of that sort is going to antagonize certain people in something over which he has no knowledge whatsoever. And it's a very pretentious sort of thing. And I tried to give the example what would happen if it was the other way around. So let's say we have a leader of a particular Muslim society who stands up and says, you know, the death penalty in the United States is un-Christian and this is not the way that a Christian nation would behave. Now, I think many of you agree with that position, but that's not the source of definition. And so it follows exactly in the same line did Professor Petrarca, associated with other American presidents, of treating people in other parts of the world as though somehow we could talk for them. That's all. And so that part of the reason they do it is Obama promised to think differently. And that's not thinking differently. That's all. Nothing more than that. So yeah, I'm sure there are piles of Muslims who agree with him. Probably if you took a survey, my guess is 60% of the Muslim population in the world at least would agree with him. But that doesn't change anything. He's not part of that world. No one called for him to make that definition. There were a number of Muslim Americans who are leaving the United States illegally to fight with ISIS, or ISIL, whatever you want to call it, whether you believe in the Levant or you believe in Syria. Are they non-Muslims? Who gets to define that? That's sort of like in the 1950s when we had a House Un-American Activities Committee who decided that certain things were un-American and other things were. Nobody should be that pretentious to decide what is or is not if it's associated with a complex belief system. I think.
Question for Professor Petrarca?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I mean, I personally wouldn't consider America.
No, it doesn't sound like a question for Professor Petrarca.
Not for Professor Schonfeld, sorry.
We're going to alternate, so I'll come back to you.
Oh.
Who has a question for Professor Petrarca? Yeah, sorry.
Professor Petrarca, you said that you're not willing to call the Obama foreign policy a success or a failure, though if we're looking from the perspective of Russia, we can certainly say that if you're Russian, you would say that Russian foreign policy has been a success. I mean, they managed Crimea, they managed to keep their port access in Syria, and that's because of Putin's willingness to show resolve and strength. Now, even though a leader can't achieve the ideal situation in all cases, wouldn't you say that Obama was more resolved and a willingness to back up his word, being a more effective leader and perhaps a more successful leader?
What's the price of oil per gallon per barrel in Russia today, and what was it 4 years ago? Do you happen to know? I mean, the Russians are in trouble. He doesn't have much time. But if you like a manly sort of leader, a muscular person who's prepared to use military force at the drop of a hat, we've had that. We've had plenty of that in this country. Plenty. If you prefer that style of leadership, then I'd ask, what's so successful about what the Russians have managed to do? Is it merely the conquest of territory? I mean, that's a 19th century sort of Monroe Doctrine view of what American politics should be. Are you upset that we haven't colonized some part of the world during Obama's presidency? We haven't subjugated some large number of people? Because that's what you're describing that the Russians have done. I mean, I don't see that as being glorious or praiseworthy at all. It is only successful in the very narrow, almost amoral sense, that if your goal was to conquer territory, okay, check, did it. What's successful about it? How does it make people's lives better off? How did it improve the quality of life for the people living in the Crimea, to say nothing of the troops that were sent there to invade? I mean, we have to be serious now. We have to be serious about asking what the alternatives are to any of the things that we're prepared to say, there you go, there's a failure. There's a failure. The red line thing. Obama managed, with or without the support of Putin, Obama managed to effectuate a solution to the chemical weapons problem without a single U.S. military person having to go in there and potentially die. That's extraordinary. And it's happened. It's not just that the Syrians have promised that it's going to happen. That has actually happened. We have not sent 3,100 advisors to Iraq. And that's not going to happen until an institution called the United States Congress passes an appropriation bill. That's waiting to happen. That hasn't happened yet. The chemical weapons are gone. Did it help the leader of Syria? Maybe. But he accomplished what he set out to accomplish by using less force. That's new, and we're uncomfortable with it, because we're used to a Putin, even though we don't like to think of ourselves this way, we're used to that kind of strategy. Problem in Guatemala, problem in Cuba, problem in the Dominican Republic, problem in Colombia, send in the Marines. That'll take care of them. Semper Fi.
If you permit me, I have to say just something briefly on the red line. The reality is Obama announced he crossed the red line. He started to talk about a military attack. He got worried that he'd have to do a military attack. He said he wouldn't do it unless the Congress supported it. And Putin came in and saved his cookies to avoid military conflict. That's what happened. This is not, and no one will ever seriously attribute this to Barack Obama's great world leadership.
I'm sorry, this is just remarkable. The idea that the only way we give a president credit, think about this, is when the president acts unilaterally. That's the only condition under which we're going to give you credit. It's the only condition. Somebody else helped us. Sorry. Oh, he came in and saved your bacon. That's the standard that you're setting.
When Obama,
I'm sorry.
When Obama took the position that to carry through on his red line statement, he would require a vote by both the Senate and the House of Representatives, the latter having no constitutional or historical role for such things.
Presidents have been voting on U.S. interventions, or rather Congress has been voting on U.S. interventions at the request of the president in the entirety of the post-World War II era. We haven't had a declared war since 1942. All of those interventions, not all of them, many of the large interventions, First Gulf War, Second Gulf War, Korea, Vietnam, those were all done with congressional approval. And the idea that Obama would, I've got the constitutional authority to do this by myself, it was prudent on his part to involve the Congress in this conversation.
The planes bombing.
Let's
Yes,
return
we
to
can
the
go.
audience. And as promised,
Be more Putin-like. Take control. No.
So my question is for President Trump. So you slightly criticized Obama for helping al-Assad. So I'm just wondering, would you prefer Syria ruled by jihadists as well as
No, I wouldn't. I mean, I'm not, my point is not to say who he should or shouldn't help. My point is, there was to point out the contradictions in what he said. The central problem with Obama is he says one thing, and then we don't know what he's going to do. You see? That's the problem, and that's a very serious problem on the part of the President of the United States. Now, mind you, you got to be very careful what you're saying when you're President of the United States. Because you're going to have to follow through on it. So you got to be very careful. He's not been as careful as he should be, so he changes. Now, as he changes, I might personally find the new thing he does better than the first thing he promised. Okay. But that's not the issue I'm looking at. The issue I'm looking at is what is the signal that this says about statements by the American president. And it says, who knows what he really means? Maybe he will bomb, maybe he won't bomb, maybe he will support, maybe he will undermine, maybe, we don't know. And that is the problem, not being a muscular or non-muscular foreign policy. Who in the world is going to support W? I mean, very, very difficult. Who would want to? Nobody. That's not the point. The point is that you need to have a vision, and you need to be very careful what you said. And this man keeps on not being careful what he says.
So maybe just follow through.
He doesn't follow his own rules. He's going to get rid of Assad, and then Zappo, there he is, effectively fighting alongside Assad. I mean, when is the last time you heard anything bad about Assad? I mean, I don't remember. This guy who was excuse me, you may be an Assadist. Not a sadist, but an Assadist. But, you know, maybe you think Assad's been wonderful. Okay. That, again, is not the point. I'm not defending or criticizing Assad. What I'm saying is the President of the United States took position A and is following position B. And that's the problem.
What about his policies where it's like, oh, well, he found the
rule that a separate question, and so that we can hear from a range of the audience. Question for Professor Petrarca, in the way back.
How do you be loud enough? Professor Petrarca, your point is basically that Obama is more liberal and not as confrontational as a past president. But as Professor Schoenfeld pointed out, we are more disliked in many parts of the world now than we were before his term in presidency. So what is your response to that? How would you say that, this is a better policy because we're more hated now?
Well, to start with, I respectfully disagree with your characterization of what I said, which seems appropriate for me to do since I said it. I never used the word liberal. Never. We can play the tape back if you don't believe me. Take some time to rewind. I never used the word liberal. Why? Easy. We've had liberal presidents before who were just as aggressive as the conservative ones, just as muscular, just as willing to use U.S. military might without really taking any prior steps to doing it. Has nothing to do with conservatism or liberalism. That's what it means to have. That's part of the old paradigm. It's what's so difficult for us to grasp. This is a president who is really authentically trying to do something new. I'm not surprised that people in the Arab world don't like him. I'm not surprised that Americans don't like his policies. They did re-elect him in 2012. And unless you're prepared to argue that the reason that they elected him was because the mighty mouse from Massachusetts, Mitt Romney, was just such a horrible, pathetic candidate that they had no choice but to elect Obama, unless you're prepared to make that argument, which I'm not, even though I said it. As recently as 2 years ago, there was still a trust in the possibility that things will turn out differently. But I'm totally sincere in my view that Obama's approach to foreign policy is so dramatically different that it becomes hard not only for Americans to understand, never mind endorse, and it becomes very hard for people abroad to understand or respect because they're used to the stick. That's what those Middle Eastern countries are used to. They're used to the United States using the stick, and they're waiting for it. They're waiting for it. And we've got plenty of people on Capitol Hill demanding that we drop bombs, put boots on the ground, invade them. The neoconservatives during the Bush presidency said once we had all these people in Iraq, what we ought to do, as though they were John Wayne on a horse, what we ought to do is mosey on over to Syria. Let's fix that problem up once we've got all the Marines on the ground in Iraq. That's what they wanted to do, the people that were advising the president. Give Bush credit for not listening to those crazy people. But that's what people there are waiting for. I'm not surprised that they wouldn't trust Obama. Why trust any American president, given U.S. history in that part of the world? What would make you think that they'd trust Obama more than anybody else?
Thank you. Question for Professor Schoenfeld. Yes, all the way in the back.
All right, Dr. Schoenfeld, you criticized Obama for having a wishy-washy response to foreign policy, but as Dr. Petrarca pointed out very astutely, it's really easy to criticize. It's really easy to say you did this wrong, you did that wrong. I am curious to know whether you have any suggestions for what Obama could have done concretely in Syria and Iraq, rather than just keeping his word.
Incidentally, my critique is focused, and I repeat, on the problems that
Excuse me, you'll have to speak up louder. Those of us who are hard of hearing can't hear you all the way to the back of the room. This is not the Bill Donahue show.
Even with the microphone, you can't hear me?
Much better now.
My critique was focused on saying one thing and then not necessarily doing that. It's very important for the leader of a country like the United States to be very careful what he or she says. It's not like us sitting down and having a cup of coffee. where one day, or us having this debate here, who the hell cares what Petrarca or I say? It's a pile of crap surrounded by manure. I mean, has no meaning in the world. So I have a right to say one thing tonight, and then you come and see me tomorrow and you say, gee, you said that. I said, oh, I didn't mean that. You misunderstood me. And I can do that. When you're president of the United States, you cannot do that. And the reason you can't do that is that your word in and of itself has weight. So if you say one thing, and then you don't do it, everyone starts wondering, well, what are the things that you said before that you are or are not going to do? That was the problem with the Red Line problem. That was the problem with ISIS as a JV team. Who cares about it? And then we send in the planes as we care about it because they're about to take over Baghdad. Now, I don't know what I would do. I mean, I don't want to cop out of your question. I think American foreign policy has been, let me try to be modest about this, has been very poorly formulated for a prolonged period of time. I think, in fact, certain mistakes that have been made before make it harder to make an intelligent foreign policy today. I think for example, a Christian country sends thousands of troops into a Muslim country to quote unquote help them, it doesn't necessarily work for some pretty obvious reasons that I've already stipulated. But then how do you deal with it afterwards? Well, certainly one thing you don't want to do is you don't want to keep on sending out little triggers that remind everyone that you might think that way. Like announcing, hey, I know what a real Islam looks like, and this isn't real Islam, and this is real Islam. See, it's very different for the guy from Pakistan. He's one of those people. He has a right to debate that. Obama doesn't. So to answer your question, I don't know what to do. And it doesn't matter, because my views don't matter. I'm not running for president of the United States. I don't have the responsibility. My responsibility is if he's doing something that's wrong, to talk about it, to bring it out, so that as we consider future leaders, hopefully we get leaders who do fewer wrong things. But I'm not going to be one of those. I realize I could be a great president. I know you'd like me to launch my campaign, but I'm just not going to do it.
Well, okay, so we have a big announcement tonight. Professor Schoenfeld is not running. We have time for one more question for each of our debaters. Question for Professor Petrarca. Yeah.
Professor Petrarca, I was wondering what your view on Obama's waffling, specifically his red line, whether that emboldens regimes such as China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, and makes a more dangerous world.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson, and it's good to see you back on campus. Let me use this as an opportunity to take up one of maybe two or three major arguments that Professor Schoenfeld has made this evening. And that is the argument that I'll generally classify under the notion of uncertainty. Obama is scary because you never know what he's going to do. You can't rely on him, right? And that's sort of the nub of what you're saying. Good. Good. Why? The political doctrine that got this country through the Cold War was something called MAD. You've read about it, maybe. Most of you were fortunate in not having to spend much of your lives living with it. Mutually assured destruction. You nuke us, we're gonna nuke you. Back to the Stone Age. This country, not the Soviet Union, refused to ever forestall the potential for a first strike. Creating what?